السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, inshallah ta'ala, we'll continue on in our series in Fiqh of Tahara, and we are still speaking about the nullifiers of al-wudoo, or the nullifiers of the minor purity. And so far, we last touched on last class upon the hukum of a man touching his private organ, and if that nullifies wudoo. From the brothers who attended, what do we say the most correct opinion is in that regard? If he touches his private part, he has to or doesn't have to? He has to make wudoo. Yeah, so the more correct opinion is that a man touching his private part, it is something that breaks the wudoo, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next mas'ala we'll take inshallah today a few masail that are tied to the same subject really. And we'll start by taking the hukum of a female touching her private organ, and if it has the same hukum as a man or if it's different. And there are three opinions in this mas'ala here. The first opinion, which is held by the Shafi'i and Hanbali madhab, and it is one of three opinions found in the Maliki madhab, and from within the Hanbali madhab it was the one held by Ibn Qudama rahimahullah, which is selected or mentioned in Al-Mughni. And this opinion is that it nullifies wudoo. So a female touching her own private organ would nullify wudoo. And they use the hadith that was mentioned in Musnad Ahmad and also in Dar Al Sunnah and Al-Bayhaqi from Amr bin Shu'ayb عن أبيه عن جده قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أيما رجل مس فرجه فليتوضأ وأي امرأة مست فرجها فلتتوضأ. So the hadith would translate to any man who touches his private part, then let him make wudoo, and any woman who touches her private part, then let her make wudoo. And Tirmidhi mentioned that Al-Bukhari, who is his shaykh, Imam Al-Bukhari is the teacher of Imam Al-Tirmidhi rahimahullah. Tirmidhi mentioned that his shaykh Al-Bukhari said that this hadith is authentic. And Imam Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah also says authentic, and Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani rahimahullah, he said that it is hasan. And they also use some other weaker hadith to support their opinion, but there's no need to go over them since we have a clear authentic proof here. Now the second opinion is that a woman touching her private part does not nullify wudoo. And this is the opinion mainly of the Hanafi madhab, and one of the opinions mentioned in the Maliki madhab, and it's the main opinion of the Maliki madhab, and it's also a second opinion found in the Hanbali madhab. So it is the main, just to recap on what I just said, it is the main opinion of the Ahnaf, and it is the second opinion in both the Hanabila and the Maliki madhab. Okay? And they use the rationale that we mentioned already, and we'll mention it again inshallah. And Ibn Qudama rahimahullah, he also mentions it, in which he says that the origin of the Tahara in this case is that it's established. Somebody, they have Tahara. So when Tahara is confirmed and established biyaqeen, then it remains valid unless there is a clear, solid, authentic proof or ijma' for it being a nullifier. Okay? And they say that in this opinion here, there is no solid proof on that because all of the proofs they claim are disputed. And they also say that the hadith that ordered wudoo, it mentions that it was for men. It mentions the male part. It says that when a man touches a dhakara, his private part, with the organ being mentioned by name, than for him to make wudoo. And they also mention that it's due to the possibility of discharge, unlike a woman. Okay, they say that it's different than a woman. And the answer to this is that to stipulate that it's due to discharge has no proof to back it up. We already went over that before. To stipulate that it only nullifies wudoo because of discharge, there's no dalil to support that at all. And if it was so, then we would say that touching the private part in and of itself doesn't nullify the wudu unless there is a discharge. And as we know, that the discharge in and of itself, anything that's kharij min as-sabilayn, anything that comes out of the two passages, nullifies wudu. Okay? And the hadith that we took already, it simply mentions touching without any further stipulation. No stipulation of desire or any stipulation of the evidence of discharge. And then the third hadith that they use is the hadith of Talq bin Ali, in which he said that touching the private part doesn't make wudu, and they compare that to a man. But we already went over this hadith multiple times, and we mentioned that it is a weak hadith. And then we have the opinion of some of the Malikiyya. They say that it nullifies the wudu, meaning a woman touching her private part, nullifies the wudu if she touches it with desire. And if we want to look at what we think to be the qawl al-rajih, or the most correct or authentic opinion, it would be wallahu a'lam, the first one, which is that the woman touching her private part nullifies wudu. Okay? And the reason for this is because we had that clear hadith that we mentioned, that if a man massa farja, or a woman massat farjaha, that she should make wudu, and he should make wudu, and she should make wudu. Also, in addition to that, even in the other narration, which is deemed to be more authentic, which only mentions the man, if a man touches his private part, that he should make wudu. Even if we were to go strictly off this narration, because it was established for men, as we mentioned, the ruling, we would say, applies also to women, because there is a fundamental principle that an-nisa are shaqa'iq al-rijal, or that women are just like the similar nature of men. Okay, when it comes to the ahkam of the sharia, for the overwhelming majority of the ahkam of the sharia, the hukum, the ahkam apply exactly the same as they do to men than to women in many, many ahkam. There is also some, without a doubt, there is distinctions, okay? When it comes to, for example, the shahada, okay, of one man is equivalent to that of two women. And there's obviously some ahkam about hayd and nifas, it does not apply to men, and so on and so forth. But overwhelmingly, what the Muslim is commanded with applies to both men and women. So, because matters like these, which we'll come to see, that are it's purely ta'abbud, okay, the ruling would be the same pertaining to women as it is to men, unless there is a proof to show otherwise, that it is only and specifically restricted to men. And it's also strengthened by qiyas or analogy, because like we said, it appears that there is no difference between a man and a woman in this regard. Next mas'ala here, which is under the subheading of mas al-farj, touching the private part. And that's if somebody touches the private part of another person. For example, a man touching the private part of his wife, a wife touching the private part of a man. Or it could also apply to something that's very, very common, maybe many people experience it on a daily basis, which is them dealing with their children. Maybe they're cleaning their children, they're changing their diaper, they're giving them a bath, and they're going to be touching the private parts. Okay? Or it could also apply to somebody who works, for example, in like a hospital or a nursing home or some type of facility where people are to be cared for, and there's an urgent need for somebody to touch the private part of another person. Okay? So, all of these examples are going to fall under this heading here. So we're talking about now, just to be clear, what is the hukum on the person who touches the private part of another person? Okay, the first opinion is that it does not nullify wudoo. And this is the opinion of the Ahnaf and of Zahiriyya. And they say the rationale that we mentioned just a few minutes ago, which is once the Tahara is established, purification is established, biyaqeen, it does not get nullified without an ijma' or a solid proof. And here there is no proof to indicate that touching somebody else's private part nullifies wudoo. Because in the hadith and the ahadith that we took, that it says if a man massa dhakara, he touched his own private part, or in another narration we just took, massa faraja, if he touches his own private part, or a woman touches her own private part, then they should make wudoo. Okay? So the wording there is very specific. And they also use the hadith of Talib bin Ali, that we said the weak hadith, which says that touching the private part doesn't necessitate wudoo. We'll just move past that quickly here because it is weak, no need to dwell upon it. And a third argument they used is that the ahadith regarding wudoo from touching the private part, like the hadith we mentioned previously about Busr bin Safwan, they said that if we're going to use them, then they're about a person touching their own private parts, as is the wording is very clear and specific, okay? And there's also a fourth proof that's mentioned in this matter here, but it's weak, so there's no really need to use it in giving credibility to this opinion. But we're going to mention it for other gharat here, and that is that the enemies of Islam, they try to slander Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and they try to attack Islam by mentioning some hadith that they find that they're really weak or sometimes even fabricated, such as this one here, which says that كنا عند النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فجاء الحسن. They were with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and then Al-Hasan came. Who was Al-Hasan? The grandson of Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وسلم. In this time, a very young child. فأقبل يتمزق فأقبل يتمرغ عليه فرفع عن قميصه وقبل زبيبته, which says that pretty much Al-Hasan was coming radiyallahu an, supposedly, and then the Rasulullah lifted up his garment and then he kissed his private part. Okay? So like we said, this hadith is da'if, it is not authentic, it is weak, it's narrated from 4 different narrations, they're all weak, they're not authentic, they're not usable, we cannot use them to support anything. Okay? For argument's sake, had the hadith been authentic, it's talking about the grandfather kissing the grandchild out of their love. But obviously they try to twist the ma'ani of these hadith, even though they're not authentic to begin with, to kind of slander Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to say, oh, look what he is doing, wal-'iyadhu billah, using names like pedophile, so on and so forth. Hashahu sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what's also very funny is that you find that on the other hand, there is actually confirmed practices that are done by, for example, al-Yahud, where they actually engage in even worse than this. Well, I don't even want to mention what it is, but perhaps some of you guys already know, and there's no need to go any further. So subhanAllah, the a'da, whenever they try to use something against Islam, many times you'll find that something that's equivalent that they try to claim about Islam, or something that's even worse, is prominent amongst themselves. Anyways, moving forward. The only reason, like I said, why I mentioned this narration is to clearly state that it is da'if, it is weak. Okay? The second opinion is that touching the private parts of somebody else nullifies the wudoo. And this is the opinion of the Shafi'i, Hanbali, Madhab. And they used the hadith of Busr bin Safwan, but they used a different narration of it, that she heard the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam ordering wudoo from touching the private part. سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يأمر بالوضوء من مس الفرج. That I heard Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وسلم commanding somebody to perform wudu from simply touching a private part. Min mass al-farj, touching a private part. Any private part is commanded to make wudu from that. Okay, but this narration of Busra radiallahu anha is worded a little bit differently. Okay, the other narrations that are clear and authentic, they are very clear in the text, which is referring to somebody touching their own private part. And in this narration here, it mentions touching private parts in general. Okay, but this report here is a shadh report. And what we mean by shadh here is that it's weak. Okay, a shadh narration is the narration of a trustworthy person that contradicts the narration of a person or people who are more reliable or trustworthy. And the correct and authentic narration of Busra bin Safwan radiallahu anha is the one that we took last week, or the last class that we had. And then the second dalil that they use to say that touching somebody else's private part nullifies wudu is the hadith that we mentioned already, مَنْ مَسَّ ذَكَرَهُ فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ. And Ibn Qudama rahimahullah, he says that, he used the rationale that if one's wudu is nullified when he touches his own private part, okay, while at times obviously it's more common and more needful for somebody to touch their own private part at times, if that nullifies wudu, then how about touching someone else's private part, which is less of a need and less common? Okay? So based off of prioritizing and making an analogy like that, he said that would definitely nullify wudu. However, the answer to this mas'ala here is that what is the illah? Okay, why is touching a private part, why does that nullify wudu? What's the illah behind it? What's the reason? Why does it nullify wudu? If we were to ask, what is the illah? What is the reason why touching the private part nullifies wudu? Because we're told to do so. Which means, in other words, it is what? It's simply or purely ta'abbud. It's just out of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, it's not like we said out of due to a desire, because there's no stipulation about that, due to the emitting of discharge, there's nothing to stipulate that. That's not why, because it's very possible that somebody can touch their private part and they don't have any discharge on it, okay? So that's not the reason. And if we were to say that, then you would say it would not in and of itself would break the wudu, but if discharge comes out, it would break the wudu. So that's not the reason. Why does touching the private part nullify wudu? It is simply ta'abbud. It is out of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Similarly, like other matters, like why in the wudu do we wash 1, 2, or 3 times? Is it because there's najasa on your arm or on your face or on your foot when you're washing? No, it's out of ta'abbud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why do we pray Salat al-Maghrib 3 rak'at and Salat al-Isha 4 rak'at? Out of ta'abbud of Allah. These are matters that we don't know the exact reasoning behind them. We do them purely out of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of worship. Okay? So that being said, the narrations which are mentioned that are authentic about this, it's only referring to somebody which is clearly and explicitly restricting it to somebody touching their own private part. And because it's a matter of ta'abbud, like we just said, we won't go past that and extrapolate from that. Okay? If we were able to derive a different illah, then maybe, but because there's no other clear illah that we can derive, and it's purely a matter of ta'abbud, then we stop at the nas, and that's what we take. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The third opinion is that touching someone else's private part only nullifies wudu if it is done with desire. That's one of the opinions of the Maliki madhab. And I just want to point out a couple things in the wording of the hadith. So in the wording it says, "Man massa dhakara," in one hadith, whoever touches his penis, in the hadith, his private part, the man. Or it says, فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ, So it's talking about فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ. The same person who touched their own private part, then he should make wudoo. Okay? And the other narration that we said that's mentioned, whoever touches a private part, that broad narration is da'if, okay, it's not usable. So, that being said, if a man touches his wife's private part, a wife touches, her husband's private part, a parent touches their children's private part, a nurse is working in a nursing home, or somebody's working in some care facility where they're touching the private part of another person, then that does not nullify the wudu. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next mas'ala here that we'll take is with regard, it's in the same, with the same circumstance if somebody's touching someone else's private part, but now we're going to talk about the person who is being touched. Is their wudu nullified or not? Okay? Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah, he mentions that there is an ijma', a consensus, that someone whose private part is touched by somebody else, the person who is being touched, tamam, he mentions that there is a consensus that their wudu is not broken. There is a consensus, he says, rahimahullah, that someone's private part being touched, the person who's being touched, their wudu is not nullified. Okay? Even though Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah, he mentions an ijma' in this regard, there is actually some Malikiya, they mentioned a different opinion. So the ijma' might not be entirely accurate. And they say that according to one opinion, the Maliki madhab, that the one who's being touched, if it's with desire, then their wudu is nullified. And the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah is the correct opinion. The person who's being touched, if someone's private part is being touched, their wudu is not nullified, and this is the more correct opinion. And the reason for that is, like we said, it's a matter of ta'abbud. We take the direct nas of the hadith, or the ahadith that are mentioned in this regard, and it's talking about somebody touching their own private part, and they having to make wudu. The one that is touching their own private part, not the one who is being touched. Another mas'ala, and inshallah ta'ala we'll conclude with this one, is about touching the rear. And what do we mean by rear? Like the back passage, okay? What's called scientifically the rectum or the anus, the back passage. Somebody touches the back passage. Does this nullify wudu or not? Okay? The first opinion is that it does not nullify the wudu. And that's the opinion of the Hanafiyya, wal Malikiyya, wal Zahiriyya, and one of the opinions of the Hanbali madhab, and they use the same hadith of Talib bin Ali, which we said is weak, that doesn't necessitate wudu from touching the private part. And then they extrapolated or made qiyas from that to the rear, to the back passage. But like we said, that hadith is weak. So the second and more important dalil in this regard, according to this opinion, is that the order to do wudu was from touching the male organ, al-dhakar, which is mentioned in the hadith, or in the other hadith al-farj. Okay? So al-dhakar is a clear description of the male organ. In Arabic, dhakar is the male organ in specific. Okay? And the origin is that the tahara, like we said, remains intact because it's established by yaqeen, and it isn't nullified unless there is something clear and authentic to prove that. And there is no proof that states that touching the back passage nullifies wudu. The second opinion says that touching the back passage does nullify wudu. It's the opinion of the Shafi'iyya and the Hanabila, and it's also the opinion chosen by Imam al-Shawkani rahimahullah. And they use the hadith we mentioned earlier about any man who touches his private part, he should make wudu, and any woman who touches her private part should make wudu. So they say that the private part, al-farj, that's mentioned in this hadith, it applies to both. However, the more correct opinion and understanding what the word farj means is that farj only applies to the private part, like the sexual organ. It does not apply to the rear. Wallahu a'lam. That being said, al-qawl al-rajih fi al-mas'ala is the first opinion, and that it does not nullify wudu. Okay? So touching the rear, the back passage, it does not nullify wudu according to the most correct opinion. And that is because we have a lack of proof to support that. And because it's a matter of ta'abbud, we don't just make up stuff, we follow exactly what is conveyed to us. And I just want to make something very, very clear, that when we're speaking about touching the backside, it's not talking about touching like the actual rear, like the buttocks, okay? By agreement of the four a'imma of the madhahib, somebody touching their rear buttocks, that it does not nullify wudu at all whatsoever, okay? So there's no dispute regarding that. Okay, what we're talking about, where the khilaf is talking about the back passage, the exit on the rear, okay? Sorry, there's one more mas'ala I'll take and it'll be very, very quick, inshallah. And that is touching, please, I know some people, they take sensitivity to using some words, but it's for the sake of ilm, so there's no need to. Is touching the testicles. Al-unthayayn. Touching the testicles doesn't nullify wudu according to the four a'imma of the madhahib. Okay? Touching the testicles does not nullify wudu according to the four a'imma of the madhahib. And simply as the previous mas'ala is because there is no proof to support that. Okay? The hadith that are mentioned in this regard, it mentions al-dhakar by name, the penis is what's mentioned in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then farj, which also is referring to the sexual organs. There is an alleged opinion which is attributed to Urwa bin Zubayr radiyallahu anhu, rahimahullah, and that's because of a hadith that's found in Dar Al and the hadith is related by Busra, that she said that she heard Rasulullah say, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, مَسَّ ذَكَرَهُ أَوْ أُنْثَيَيْهِ. Okay. So in this hadith it's saying, whoever touches their penis or their testicles, أو what is the translation for this? Inshallah. It's mentioning about these two and then a third as well. Whoever touches their penis or their testicles, it's mentioned in this regard that they have to make wudu. However, this hadith that's related by Busra, okay, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah said this is hadith mawdu', it's fabricated. And Dar Al said rahimahullah that the addition of the testicles is the wording from Urwa, not from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And in a different narration where Urwa radiyallahu anhu, he mentioned touching the sexual organ nullifies wudu, and he attributed that to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Okay, so in that narration, which is separate and clear from his own wording, he added testicles from his self, not from the kalam of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And that narration that Dar Al says is authentic. So just to conclude, to finish off here, that there is no proof to suggest that touching the back passage or al-untayayn, the testicles, nullifies wudu, and according to the four a'imma, there is no khilaf amongst them regarding that. Because there is a lack of proof, and because it's a matter of ibadah, we have to base our ibadah, ibadah by default is qat'iyyah. Ibadah is tawqifiyah, so we cannot invent an ibadah. So saying the nullification of wudu is ibadah. Having to make wudu from something is ibadah. We cannot invent the ibadah just from ourselves. Any ibadah that we engage in or we perform has to be clearly established by something in the sharia, as it is tawqifiyah, wallahu a'lam. Just to recap, what we took in this heading of Mass al-Farj and it nullifying wudu. If a male or a female were to touch their own private parts, it nullifies wudoo. If a male or a female were to touch somebody else's private parts, it does not nullify wudoo. If a male or a female is to be touched, their private parts, by somebody else, it does not nullify their wudoo. And if somebody touches their backside, their rear, their back passage, it does not nullify wudoo. Likewise, touching just like the buttocks does not nullify wudoo. And then the last one, touching the testicles, it does not nullify wudoo. So just to sum it up, the only thing that nullifies wudoo when it comes to Mas al-Farj is the individual touching themselves. Just to make it very clear and easy to remember. Okay? And inshallah we'll just conclude this dars, and we'll continue on inshallah ta'ala next week. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, jazakumullahu khairan. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد والحمد لله رب العالمين.